"Don't let them do it," the boy whispered, grabbing the sleeve of the most powerful man in the room. "Your mother isn't dying. Someone is making sure she never wakes up." Richard Calloway had not slept in 11 days. That was the number written in the margins of his notebook, the one he kept beside the hospital bed where his mother lay with tubes running into her arms and a machine breathing for her because her lungs had forgotten how. 11 days since the call came. 11 days since he had driven through the October dark from his office in downtown Toronto to this hospital in Barrie, convinced the whole drive that he would arrive too late. He hadn't, but being on time hadn't helped much either. Eleanor Calloway was 73 years old and had the stubbornness of a woman half her age. She had raised Richard alone after his father left, worked 2 jobs through his childhood without a single word of complaint, and never once asked him for anything. Not money, not time, not even a phone call on the days he forgot. She had simply continued existing, warm and constant as a radiator in winter, until one morning in September she hadn't gotten out of bed, and her neighbor had found her on the kitchen floor 3 hours late. The doctors called it a neurological event. They said the word event, the way people say incident, when they mean something much worse. They measured her brain activity in numbers Richard didn't understand, showed him charts that curved in the wrong direction, and spoke to him in a hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee. The neurologist, a Dr. Harlan Voss, who wore his silver hair swept back like a television doctor and smiled in a way that never reached his eyes, had explained in careful and practiced language that Eleanor's prognosis was not good. "She may not recover meaningful function," Dr. Voss had told him. "At some point, you will need to consider quality of life." Richard had nodded, because that was what you did in hallways like that one, and then he had gone back into the room and held his mother's hand and not let himself think about what consider quality of life actually meant. That had been 6 days ago. Since then, his wife Diane had arrived. She had brought a rolling suitcase and a casserole and a folder of printed documents that she had laid on the side table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Diane was 44 and beautiful and organized, and Richard had married her 3 years ago at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake with champagne and speeches and his mother smiling from the front row. He had believed then that he was happy. Now he watched Diane speak to Dr. Voss in the corridor, her head tilted at a concerned angle, her voice low and careful, and something in the back of his mind, something small and cold, noticed that she never went into the room. She never held Eleanor's hand. She had arranged flowers in a vase near the window and straightened the blankets once, but she had not sat down beside the bed and simply been there the way you do when someone is still a person to you. He told himself he was being unfair. Grief made people strange. He told himself that. The boy's name was Theo. He was 11 years old, and he lived in a rooming house 4 blocks from the hospital with his grandmother, Mrs. Patricia Osey, who cleaned the 3rd-floor surgical ward every weekday morning from 6 until noon. Patricia had worked at St. Andrew's Regional for 14 years. She knew every supply closet, every squeaky wheel on every cart, every shortcut through the back corridors that visitors never saw. And sometimes, when the schools were closed or Theo had nowhere to go, she brought him with her. He was not supposed to be there. He knew that. He wore his school backpack to look like he was passing through, and he kept his eyes down in the elevators. And he had learned over the years exactly which nurses were the kind who would stop him, and which ones were the kind who were too busy to notice a small boy moving quietly along a wall. Theo had what his grandmother called a gift for listening. She meant it as a compliment. His mother had called it that habit of lurking, and she had not meant it as a compliment at all. But she wasn't around anymore to say so, and Patricia had told Theo, the night after the funeral, that some gifts were only understood by people who weren't frightened of them. He had discovered Eleanor Calloway on a Tuesday. He hadn't meant to. He had been sitting on a chair outside a linen closet eating a granola bar and waiting for his grandmother to finish a section of the hall, and he had noticed a man in an expensive coat standing very still outside room 318, staring at the closed door with an expression Theo recognized, not grief exactly, more the thing that came after grief, when you were too tired to cry anymore and you just stood in doorways instead. Theo had seen that expression on his own face in a mirror the week his mother died. He had gone home that evening and not thought about the man, But the next day, passing room 318 with a mop bucket, he had heard voices through the door, a woman's voice, low and professional, the kind of voice that was choosing words carefully. He stopped. He knew how to stop without looking like he was stopping. The most humane course of action, the woman was saying. Dr. Voss agrees. The longer we wait, the more difficult this becomes for everyone. A pause. The man's voice rougher and quieter. She could still. Richard. The woman's voice softened in a way that Theo didn't quite trust. She's not there anymore. You know that. You've known it for days. This is just letting her go. Theo stood very still with one hand on the mop handle. He had heard that phrase before. Letting go. People said it like it was gentle. His grandmother had explained to him once, in the direct way she explained things, that it was sometimes gentle and sometimes it was something else wearing the costume of gentle. He walked away. He did his job. He went home. But that night, lying on his mattress with the streetlight coming through the curtain, he thought about the woman's voice, the way it had softened at exactly the right moment, the way it had moved toward the man called Richard like water, finding a crack. Theo had heard voices like that before. His mother's boyfriend, the one who had borrowed money and then disappeared, had a voice like that. His teacher in grade 3, that wasn't good enough for the school display, and then smiled while she said it, and then smiled while she said it. She'd had a voice like that. He went back to the hospital the following morning before school. He took his time. He moved through the ward the way he always did, invisible and unhurried, until he found a position near the nurse's station where he could see into room 318 through the interior window without being seen himself. He watched for 40 minutes. He watched the woman, tall, dark-haired, wearing the kind of clothes that were simple but expensive, walk in and out of the room with that same organized efficiency, speaking to nurses, speaking to a man in a white coat who must have been Dr. Voss, checking something on her phone. She went into the room twice. Both times, Theo watched through the window. She stood beside the bed. She looked at the older woman lying there, but she never touched her hand. She looked at her the way you look at a problem you are in the process of solving. The second time she left, she passed the nurse's station and said something to the nurse, cheerful, warm, grateful, and then she was gone. And then something happened. Dr. Voss came to the room. He was alone. He checked over his shoulder once, a small movement, and then he went inside. He was there for 4 minutes, Theo counted. When he left, he was doing up the button of his white coat, like something had come undone while he was in there. Theo didn't know exactly what he had seen. He was 11 years old, not a detective. He was also not stupid, and he had his grandmother's gift for noticing things that were off by a fraction. He found Richard Calloway in the family waiting room on the 2nd floor, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his coffee going cold, staring at the floor. The man looked up when Theo appeared in the doorway, not alarmed exactly, more like he'd run out of the energy that alarm required. "You've been here before," Richard said. "I've seen you in the hall." Theo came in and sat down 2 chairs away, the way his grandmother had taught him, close enough to talk, far enough not to frighten. "My grandma works here," he said. "Cleaning staff." "Ah!" Richard looked back at the floor. "The woman in your mom's room," Theo said. "The one with the dark hair." A pause. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "That's my wife. She goes in when you're not there," Theo said carefully. "And Dr. Voss. He went in this morning, by himself. He was only there for a few minutes." Richard looked at him now, really looked at him. A long, complicated look. "Lots of doctors check on patients," he said slowly. "That's their job." "I know," Theo said. But he checked over his shoulder first, before he went in. The silence was different after that. Richard put his cup down on the table beside him with a small click. "You're how old?" 11. "And you're telling me—" Richard stopped, rubbed his face with both hands. "What are you telling me?" Theo thought about how to say it. He was careful with words because he knew they could break things. "I don't know what I'm telling you exactly," he said. "I just think you should be in the room more, and I think you should ask the nurses, the regular nurses, not Dr. Voss, what they actually think. By themselves, without him there." Richard went back to the room. He sat beside his mother for 3 hours, which was longer than he'd managed in days, because the room felt suffocating and the chair was uncomfortable, and being there meant accepting the fact that she might not come back, and he wasn't ready. But he sat there, and he watched the monitors, and at some point in the early afternoon, When Diane brought him a sandwich from the cafeteria and stood in the doorway with that careful sympathy in her eyes, he found himself looking at her differently. He went to find Nurse Clara Mbenga that evening, the one with the short locks who had always been the most straightforward with him. He found her in the supply room at shift change, and he asked her, simply quietly, without Diane or Dr. Voss in earshot, what she thought. About Eleanor, about the prognosis, about whether it was time. Clara was quiet for a moment. She closed the supply cabinet. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "your mother's charts from last week were more positive than what's being communicated to you. She had 2 nights where the brain activity was stronger. Dr. Voss noted them, and then they weren't mentioned at the family meeting." The room was very quiet. "Why wouldn't they mention that?" Richard asked. Clara looked at him with the expression of someone who had been a nurse for 19 years and had learned exactly how much to say and when. "That," she said carefully, "is a question you have every right to ask. In writing, to the hospital's patient advocate." What came apart over the next 48 hours came apart quietly, the way the most significant things usually do, not with a dramatic confrontation in a white corridor, not with raised voices or pointed fingers, but with paperwork and phone calls, and a patient advocate named Mr. Singh who wore a brown cardigan and asked questions in a voice so calm it was almost boring, and that calmness somehow made everything more serious. Richard asked for a second neurological assessment. He was entitled to one. Dr. Voss said it was unnecessary. Richard asked anyway. The second neurologist was a woman named Dr. Amara Nkosi, who had driven up from Hamilton and who reviewed Eleanor's file with the thorough, unhurried attention of someone who had nothing to gain by the outcome either way. She ordered additional tests. She reviewed the suppressed chart entries. She met with Richard in the same hallway that smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, but she did not smile in the practiced way Dr. Voss had smiled. "Your mother is not recovering at the rate the previous assessment suggested," she said, "but she is not at the point of no return. There has been deliberate misrepresentation of her status in the documentation I've reviewed. I'm obligated to report that." Diane had left the hospital by then. She had taken her rolling suitcase and said she needed a few days at home, and Richard had watched her go and felt, not grief exactly, more a cold and clarifying relief, the kind you felt when a storm finally broke after days of pressure building in the air. He sat with his mother and held her hand and talked to her about nothing, about the drive up Highway 400, about the geese he'd seen on the median, about the granola bar wrappers he'd found in his coat pocket from some months ago and couldn't remember buying. He talked until his voice was rough, and then he kept talking anyway. On the 4th morning, Eleanor Calloway opened her eyes. It happened the way these things always happen in reality, not dramatically, not with a gasp and a sudden return to full consciousness, but slowly, reluctantly, like someone surfacing from very deep water. Her eyes opened. They were unfocused. Then they found the ceiling. Then they found Richard's face, and something shifted in them. Recognition, faint as a candle through fog, but real. "Hey, Mum," he said. Her mouth moved. No sound. But her fingers, the ones he was holding, pressed once against his palm. He cried then, and he wasn't ashamed of it. He pressed his face into the blanket beside her hand and cried, like he was 12 years old again, like she was still the person who fixed everything by simply being in the room, and she let him, because that was what Eleanor Calloway had always done. She let the people she loved fall apart next to her without making it worse. The investigation into Dr. Harlan Voss took time, as investigations always do. There were lawyers involved and documents and a review by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario that was formal and procedural and would not reach its conclusion for many months. What emerged, over weeks of careful investigation, was a pattern that had existed before Eleanor and would have continued after her, a relationship between Voss and certain beneficiaries of certain estates, facilitated by documentation that turned recoverable patients into lost causes. Diane's name was in the emails, not prominently, and her lawyer argued nuance, but her name was there. Richard did not attend the hearings. He spent that time in Barrie instead, driving Eleanor to her physiotherapy appointments in the mornings, bringing her tea in the afternoons, watching her argue with the television the way she always had. She was not entirely the woman she had been before. Some things had changed, some words came more slowly, some memories arrived in the wrong order. But she was Eleanor. She was stubborn and warm and present, and she was alive, and that was the thing that made all the other things bearable. Theo came to see her once in late November, on a Saturday when his grandmother had a shift and brought him along. Patricia knocked on the door of room 318, which was now a regular room with no machines and a window full of gray November sky, and Eleanor looked up from her crossword puzzle and said, "Oh, Patricia, come in, and who is this?" "This is my grandson, Theo," Patricia said. Theo stood in the doorway the way he always stood in doorways, assessing, careful, and then Eleanor pointed at the chair beside the bed with her pen and said, "Well, come sit down then. I don't bite. Unless you're a crossword clue. Do you know a 7-letter word for tenacious?" Theo thought about it. "Dogged," he said. D-O-G-G-E-D. Eleanor counted the letters on her fingers. "Oh, that's it. You're smart." "My grandma says I'm observant," Theo said, sitting down. "Same thing," Eleanor said firmly. "People just don't like to say smart because they think it sounds braggy. It's not braggy. Being smart is useful. Being observant is useful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She looked at him over the top of her reading glasses with the expression of someone delivering important information. "You're the boy who talked to my son." Theo nodded carefully. Eleanor set the crossword down. "I want you to know," she said in a voice that had gotten quieter, "that I know I'm here because of that. Richard told me." She paused and her eyes were very clear. "Thank you." Theo looked at the floor, then back at her. "I just said what I noticed," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's how it usually works." Richard found Theo in the corridor afterward, waiting for Patricia to finish her last section of the hall. "You've got some time before she's done?" Richard asked. Theo shrugged. "Usually about an hour." Richard sat down on the bench along the wall, the same way Theo sat, unhurried, making space. He'd learned that from watching the boy do it. "What do you want to do when you're older?" he asked. Theo considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything. "I don't know yet. Something where you figure things out." "Like what?" "I don't know. Law, maybe. Or medicine. Something where noticing things matters." Richard nodded. He looked down the hallway where Patricia's cart moved steadily along. Then he looked at Theo. "I have a foundation," he said. "It's not very big yet. It funds secondary school programs for kids who need a bit of extra. Not charity exactly, more like opportunity." He paused. "I'd like to set aside a spot for when you're old enough, if you want it." Theo looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," Richard said. "That's sort of the point." The hallway was quiet. Somewhere around the corner, the cleaning cart wheels squeaked on the linoleum, steady and familiar. Theo looked at his hands, then out the window at the gray November sky. "Okay," he said. It was not a dramatic word. It was an 11-year-old's word, practical and small. But Richard heard in it everything that wasn't being said. The careful hope of a boy who had learned not to expect too much from the world, deciding, just this once, to expect a little more. Down the hall, Eleanor Calloway picked up her crossword again, turned the puzzle sideways the way she always did when she was stuck, and found the word she was looking for. She smiled and wrote it in.